In this fast MySQL tutorial, I'm going to show you step by step on how to set up the world's most popular SQL database with the FastAPI application. My name is Eric Roby. I'm an instructor, a software engineer, and a cloud enthusiast. My channel covers everything tech. And with that, let's dive in and let's set up MySQL with FastAPI. All right, friends, in this video, we are going to set up FastAPI with the most popular relational database, MySQL. So the very first thing, as I always do in every FastAPI video, let's go ahead and open up our terminal and let's create a virtual environment for our application. In this virtual environment, we'll silo this FastAPI and MySQL application from all the other Python applications you may have on your PC. So let's go ahead and just say Python 3-m venv. When you do this, you'll see that we created an environment within our directory. And now we can go ahead and install all the dependencies we need for FastAPI to work with MySQL. Now, what we need to install is FastAPI, uvicorn, SQLAlchemy, which is the ORM, the object relational mapping for our FastAPI application to be able to communicate with our MySQL. You know, do some of the queries for us. We can just use Python to fetch data from the database. And then lastly, we need to install PyMySQL, which is a connection that will make our FastAPI application be able to communicate easily to our MySQL database. After you type that in, let's go ahead and say enter. And I totally forgot to even start my environment. So from here, let's go ahead and just say source env/bin/activate. Once you do that, let's go ahead and just redo our pip install of FastAPI, uvicorn, SQLAlchemy, and PyMySQL. And that'll install all the dependencies we need on our application. All right, so now the very first thing we need to do is let's go ahead and just create our database.py file. This is going to have all of our connection strings for our application to be able to connect it to MySQL. So the very first thing we can say here is from SQLAlchemy, we want to import our create engine, and this will be able to create the engine for our database to be able to communicate with our application. We want to say from SQLAlchemy.orm. Let's go ahead and import our session maker. And then let's say from SQLAlchemy.ext.declarative. And from here, we just want to import a declarative base. So this is awesome stuff. We are getting closer to being able to connect our database to our FastAPI application. So the next thing we want to say here is URL to our database. And let's just leave this empty for now until we set up our MySQL database. And then let's go ahead and say engines. We need to create a engine variable with our create engine, where we will pass in our URL database. And then let's go ahead and say we need to create our session local, which is going to be equal to our session maker, where we can say auto commit is equal to false. We can say our auto flush is equal to false, and our bind is equal to our engine. So last thing we need to do now is just go ahead and say base equals our declarative base. Now, once you do this, we are like 99% connected to our database. We just need to get our URL database, but we'll do that in just a little bit. The next thing we want to do is go ahead and create our models.py file. Now, our models.py file is going to be what SQLAlchemy, which is our ORM, uses to be able to create the tables that we need in our MySQL database. So it's super powerful, where we just need to create the database, and then SQLAlchemy, using this model that we're about to create and some other keywords, will initialize and instantiate the database table that we need with the columns that we need to be able to save records. So this is an awesome thing to be able to implement into our FastAPI and MySQL application. So from here, we can just say from SQLAlchemy, we want to import booleans, columns, integers, and a string. And we want to say from database, import our base. So what we just made in our database, which is our base equals declarative base, we want to then bring this over into our models.py. All right, so the application that we're building is going to have users and posts. So it's like a mini simple blog application where a user is only going to have a username, but they're going to be assigned to a post, and that post is going to have a couple different pieces of data. So we are essentially going to be creating two MySQL tables that are going to be communicating with one another for our application. So what we want to do here is just say class user and pass in base. And we can instantiate the table and name the table right here by saying underscore underscore table name underscore underscore, or we can just call this the users table database. All right, and now let's say, and now we need to create our first column, which is going to be an ID. And we want to say this is going to be a column where it's going to be an integer. It's also going to be our primary key, so we can say primary key equals true. And then we want it to be indexable, and we're going to make that equal to true. And index just means it's going to increase the performance of MySQL a little bit when we search by ID. So essentially, we're just saying that this is going to be a term that we're going to be using to fetch data from the database. We also want the user to have a username, so we can say username equals column, where we pass in a string, and we want to instantiate this string with a varchar of 50. So in the database, it's going to be a varchar, which means we need to tell the database how long the string is going to be. So we can say it's going to be a string of 50, and it's going to be unique. So a primary key will always be unique, but since a username is not a primary key, we just also want it to be unique because we don't want multiple users in the application to have the same username. We then want to say class post and pass in base. And now inside here, we want to say underscore underscore table name underscore underscore, and we want this equal to posts. And we want to say ID equals column. So we also want our post to have a primary key, which is going to be an integer. Primary key is going to be equal to true, and it's going to be able to be indexed. We want the title to also equal a column, where the string is going to be 50. We want the content to equal column, where the string will be equal to 100 because we want it to be about twice as long. So the title is going to be 50 characters and the content can be up to 100 characters. And then we want the user ID, which is going to be the foreign key that tracks it back to the user database. And we want this to just be a column of integer. So here we have two tables that we're going to be creating: a user known as users in the database with an ID and username, and a post, which is going to have a table name of posts, ID, title, content, and user ID. All right, right on. Now the next thing we want to do here is right click and say a new main.py file, which is going to be the main application for this FastAPI application, which is going to be the main file for this FastAPI application. We need to say from FastAPI, import FastAPI. And while we're here, we might as well add the other dependencies that we need from FastAPI. So we can say HTTP exception. We can say depends, which is our dependency injection. And then we can also just import status. We want to say from Pydantic, import base model, and this is going to be our data validation. We then want to say from typing, import annotated. We want to import all of our models from our models.py file. And then we want to say from our database, import engine and our session local. And then lastly, we need to import our session from SQLAlchemy.orm. So we can say from SQLAlchemy.orm, import our session. All right, so this is awesome stuff. Now, as always, with every FastAPI application, we need to instantiate the app. So we can say app equals FastAPI with parentheses, and we want to say models.base.metadata.createAll, where we can pass in our bind that is going to be equal to our engine. And now we can move on with creating our Pydantic models. So the very first model that we want to create in this application is for our posts. So we can say class post base and pass in our base model, where we can say we want a title of string, content of string, and a user ID of int. Now again, we're using this for our data validation. So the request that comes in, we want to be able to validate the data and then return the response that's correct from the database. We then want to say class user base, where we're also going to be calling the super of base model. But this one's only going to have a username of type string. All right, great stuff. Now we want to move on and create our dependency for our database. And we can do this by saying def getDB and inside here, we want to say db equals our session local. We want to try and yield our DB. And finally, db.close. And what this really means is we're going to be creating a method of getDB where we can create a DB of our session local. We'll try and get our DB, but no matter what happens, we're always going to close our connection because we don't want to keep our connection to our database open for too long. Now, the next thing is we need to create a annotation for our database for dependency injection, where we can just say db_dependency equals annotated, where we pass in our session, and this depends on getDB. All right, right on. Now we can kind of move on to creating our MySQL database and that connection string that we need to get to our application. So the very first thing we need to do is let's go ahead and open up our MySQL Workbench. And now if you don't already have MySQL and MySQL Workbench installed, I'll be creating a video on how to install MySQL and MySQL Workbench on your local machine. You'll be able to find it somewhere around me, and you'll be able to switch to that video, watch that video, and then come back. But for the time being, let's go ahead and just say right click. And when we right click here, we can say create schema, and that's going to be on the left hand side. We want to say create schema. And inside of here, let's go ahead and just say blog application. We type that in the schema name, and then let's come down here where we see apply, and let's click apply. And then it'll give us what the script is going to look like, where it's create schema blog application, and we can just click apply again and then close. When you do that, we can see that we now have a new blog application, and this is going to be a database. This is a database, so our blog application is a database, but we currently don't have anything in our tables. So let's go back to our application. Let's hop into our database.py file, and right here, we want to say MySQL plus PyMySQL :// and now we need to type in the username, and for my local environment it's root, and then colon our password, and for me it's test1234 ! And then we need to say at our local host, and then our local host MySQL sits on the port of 3306 by default, so just say :3306. And then we need the name of our database, and mine is blog application. All right, so once we type all that in, let's go back to our main.py file. Let's now create our first API endpoint where we can create and save a user, and we can see that we're going to instantiate these tables in MySQL automatically using SQLAlchemy and FastAPI. So from here, let's just go ahead and say @app.post, and in here we want this to be /users, and we want this to return a status code of status.http 201 created. Let's make this an async def of create user, where we can pass in our user of user base for our data validation of Pydantic, and then DB of DB dependency. Let's then say our DB user is going to be equal to our models.user, and inside here we can say *user.dictionary of user.dictionary. And what this means is we are able to get all of the data from our data validation of user, and we can deserialize it into an object that we already have defined, which is user. And then we can say db.add our user, and then db.commit. After typing that in, and we want this to be inside here actually, so db user inside our add before committing. Now let's go back to our terminal, and let's go ahead and say uvicorn main:\app -- reload. And now that we're here, let's open up this user, and let's go ahead and just say try it out, and we'll call this user coding with Roby. Let's then scroll down and say execute. Here we can see that we get a 201 and a null response body, which means our API endpoint request was successful. So now let's go into MySQL Workbench, and here we can see our blog application database, and now let's right click on our tables and then say refresh all. When you do that, we can see that we now have a posts table and a users table. If we say select all from posts, which we can say that by saying select *posts, and we click this lightning bolt, we can see that the table is currently empty, but we do have an ID, title, content, and user ID. If we change this to users and we click the lightning bolt, we can see that there is a record in our database, and it has an ID of 1 and a username of coding with Roby. All right, so let's go back to our code, and let's create a new API endpoint to be able to fetch this user. And we can do this by saying @app.get, and inside here we want to say /users/ and then I'm going to pass in user_ID, and we want this to have a status code of status.200 OK. We then want to say async def read user, where we can pass in a user ID of type int and a DB of our DB dependency. We then want to say user equals db.query, where we want to pass in our models of our user, where we can filter by models.user. user.id and seeing if that's equal to our user ID, and then just return the first element from our database that matches this filter. We then want to say if user is none, we want to raise an HTTP exception with a status code of 404, where we can say detail equals user not found. However, if the user is found, we want to return that user. So if we go ahead and try this application and we close the post and we open up the Git and we pass in a 1 as the ID for the path parameter, we're gonna get our coding with Roby user returned. All right, so now let's go ahead and move from users and let's go ahead and create the posts. So the very first thing we want to do here is I'm going to do it above these user dependencies, app.post. And inside here, we want to say /posts, comma, our status code is going to be status.http 201 because we're creating the post, async def, create post, where we pass in a post of our post base, which we're using for Pydantic for our data validation, which is going to accept 3 things, our title, content, and user ID. And we need our DP of DB dependency. We want our DB post to equal our models.post. And inside here, we can deserialize post again by doing **post.dictionary. We can then say db.add, and we want to pass in our DB post, and then db.commit. All right, so if we go back to our application now and we refresh and we say we want to use this post, we can say try it out, and we can say title of learn FastAPI. This is a super cool piece of tech, and we want the ID be from our coding with Roby user, so 1. And then we can say execute. And here we're gonna get null of 201. And if we check out our MySQL Workbench, we can now say from posts. And when we run this, we can now see there is a record for posts, which has an ID of 1, title learn FastAPI, content. This is a super cool piece of tech with a user ID of 1. All right, so let's just keep chugging along and let's create a couple more API endpoints for our post. Let's now go ahead and say @app.get, and here we want to say /posts by the post ID. So we are now checking for only 1 post based on the post ID. So we want to say @app.get /posts post ID. And we want to say status code is equal to our status code of status.200. We want to say async def. And here we want to say read post, where we can pass in our post ID that is going to be of type int. And we of course want our DB of DB dependency. All right, and now from here, we want to say post equals DB, where we can say db.query and pass in our models.post, where we can filter by our models.post.id. When this equals our post underscore ID dot first. And then as before, so if post is none, we want to throw an HTTP exception with a status code of 404 saying that post was not found. And we need this to be the detail equals. And if everything's good, we'll just return the post. So let's go back into our Chrome browser and we will say we want to read the post, pass in the 1 for the ID, and there now we have literally the MySQL record of the post. All right, this is awesome stuff. Let's go ahead and just do one more request for delete, where we can say @app.delete. And here we can say /posts/post ID, where this status code will be a status of 200. And we can say async def delete post, where we will pass in our post ID of type int, and again, our DB of DB dependency. And just like we did before, we want to say DB post equals our db.query, where we can say models.post.filter or models.post.id is equal to our post ID, and then grab the very first record that's returned from our database. And if the db.post is none, we want to raise an HTTP exception with a status code of 404 with a detail of post was not found. We then can say db.delete, pass in our db post, and then say db.commit. So if we save this and go back to our browser and we refresh, we know that we have an post with an ID of 1. And if we come down here, we can now try it out and delete that exact same post. So if we come back up here, there is no post inside here. So this is awesome stuff. We have essentially created a FastAPI application using MySQL database. If you like this video, please give it a like or a comment, and I will see you in the next video.